1930s, American motorcycles were already defined by two names. Harley-Davidson and Indian dominated the roads, the dealerships, and the racing circuits. They built strong machines, reliable machines that reflected stability during uncertain times. But beneath that stability, there was a quiet frustration among racers. The bikes were powerful for their era, but they were not radical. They were not built to push the edge of possibility. They were built to sell in volume. Albert Crocker did not think like a volume producer. He thought like a racer who had seen what speed could do and what compromise could ruin. He had grown up in the violent era of board track racing, where motorcycles ran on wooden tracks at speeds that terrified spectators. In 1912, when a crash killed racer Eddie Hasha and 4 young boys in the crowd, American racing gained a reputation for danger that never fully faded. Crocker understood that world intimately. He respected speed, but he also understood the engineering required to survive it. He did not want to sell motorcycles. He wanted to build the fastest one in America. By the 1920s, Crocker was managing Indian dealerships, learning how the business side worked while sharpening his mechanical instincts. He had a technical mind that never stayed still. In Los Angeles in 1930, he opened a shop selling used Harleys and Indians, but he did not stop there. He began developing high-performance parts. One of his early innovations was a steering damper patent, an advanced idea for its time. It was a small signal of something larger. Crocker was not satisfied with what the big manufacturers were offering. He wanted control over the machine and eventually control over the entire engine. The American motorcycle industry in the early 1930s was stable but cautious. The Great Depression had reshaped the economy. Manufacturers were focused on survival. Harley-Davidson and Indian were not experimenting wildly. They were refining proven formulas. Crocker saw that caution as weakness. He understood that corporations protected reputation. Racers chased performance, and he still saw himself as a racer first. While Harley was building safe motorcycles for a shrinking market, Crocker was preparing to build something they would not dare attempt. The turning point came with Speedway racing. Imported from Europe and Australia, Speedway was short track, high-intensity, alcohol-fueled competition. It was explosive, technical, and brutal. Crocker recognized immediately that this format rewarded engineering innovation. To compete under New American Motorcyclist Association 500 cubic centimeter rules, he modified Indian Scout engines with overhead valve conversions. These alcohol-burning machines delivered serious power. They began beating the dominant Rudge bikes that had controlled the scene, but Crocker saw a problem. Reworking someone else's engine meant inheriting its weight and limitations. The converted Scouts were fast, but they were not ideal. The blocks were heavy. The architecture was not purpose-built for Speedway. If Crocker wanted to win consistently, he would need an engine designed purely for racing. In 1933, he partnered with Paul Bigsby and did something few American builders would dare. They designed a single-cylinder overhead valve engine from the ground up. Not a modification, not an upgrade, a clean sheet design. Even in that era, this was ambitious. Building an engine required machining capability, casting knowledge, and testing discipline. It required money and risk during one of the worst economic periods in American history. When the Crocker Speedway bike debuted at Emeryville in California, the risk paid off instantly. It won 9 of 12 heats on its first night. The crowd recognized something different. This was not a modified Indian. It was a machine that had been engineered specifically to dominate its class. When Crocker was asked to speak, he did not celebrate. He said simply that the bikes were good, but they would be better. He was not chasing wins, he was chasing superiority. Only around 30 of these Speedway bikes were ever built. Crocker lacked the infrastructure to produce in volume, but the laboratory phase was complete. He had proven that purpose-built engineering could outperform modified factory equipment. He had proven that independence could beat establishment. What he learned on the dirt tracks of Speedway racing would not remain confined there. He had mastered overhead valve architecture. He understood airflow, combustion efficiency, and weight reduction. He understood that engine layout determined everything about performance. And he understood something else that would define his legacy. If you want to beat the giants, you cannot build what they are building. You must build what they are afraid to. By 1936, Crocker was ready to apply everything he had learned to the street. Not a race-only machine, not a parts conversion, a complete American motorcycle that would redefine what performance meant. The Crocker V-Twin was not conceived as a competitor to Harley. It was conceived as a rebuke. It featured a 45-degree V-Twin layout with hemispherical combustion chambers and overhead valves, making it the first American big twin to adopt such an advanced configuration. Most engines were around 61 cubic inches, roughly 1,000 cubic centimeters, producing 55 to 60 horsepower. That was about 50% more power than Harley or Indian were delivering at the time. Top speed exceeded 110 miles per hour. In the mid-1930s, that number was almost unbelievable for a production American motorcycle. Harley-Davidson would introduce its Knucklehead shortly after, a machine considered revolutionary for its time. Yet even upon release, it was heavier and slower than the Crocker. Crocker had leaped ahead before Harley had completed its evolution. America's first Superbike did not come from Milwaukee. It came from a small shop in Los Angeles. The Crocker V-twin was not assembled from spare parts. The engine, transmission, and most critical components were built in-house. Customers could order customized displacements and tune levels. Each machine was effectively bespoke. Fewer than 72 big twins were ever produced. They were rare the moment they left the shop. Crocker even offered a money-back guarantee. If a stock Harley or Indian beat a Crocker in a drag race, the owner could return it for a full refund. No one ever did. By the late 1930s, Crocker had built a motorcycle that was lighter, fatter, and more advanced than anything else produced in America. It felt like a machine from a later decade, a post-war performance bike appearing before the war had even begun. He had embarrassed the giants not through advertising but through engineering. And yet, speed alone does not determine survival. The same independence that allowed Crocker to out-engineer Harley would soon expose the limits of a small operation competing in an unforgiving economy. By the time Harley-Davidson unveiled the Knucklehead in 1936, the company believed it had delivered a technical breakthrough. Overhead valves replaced the old flathead layout. Cooling was improved. Styling felt modern. It was a proud moment for Milwaukee, a signal that Harley was not standing still. But there was a problem that few wanted to say out loud. Crocker had already built something faster. The Crocker V-twin was lighter. It produced more horsepower. It accelerated harder. It reached speeds that most American riders had never experienced on a street machine. While Harley's Knucklehead was celebrated as advanced, it entered the market already trailing in raw performance. Crocker's engine output of roughly 55 to 60 horsepower was not theoretical. It translated directly to a top speed exceeding 110 miles per hour. That number mattered in the 1930s. It was not marketing language. It was dominance measured by the speedometer. Crocker understood how to make that dominance visible. He did not hide behind advertising slogans. He offered a direct challenge. If your Crocker lost a drag race to a stock Harley or Indian, you could return it for a full refund. That was not a symbolic gesture. It was a public declaration of confidence. Harley and Indian could not make that offer. They relied on reputation. Crocker relied on measurable performance. The giant sold heritage. Crocker sold proof. This rivalry was not fought through corporate statements. It was fought through acceleration and torque. Harley-Davidson was producing motorcycles in significant numbers. Crocker was producing them by hand. Yet the small shop in Los Angeles had built a machine that forced comparison at every stoplight. It embarrassed the established order without a marketing department or national dealer network. The difference was not only horsepower, it was philosophy. Harley built for broad appeal. Crocker built for the rider who wanted the absolute limit. Each Crocker V-twin was assembled with obsessive attention to detail. The engine and transmission were manufactured in-house. The frame used the engine as a stressed member, an idea that would not become mainstream for decades. Weight reduction was not an afterthought, it was a foundation. This approach made the Crocker feel different from the moment it moved. Contemporary writers described the sound as sharper, more urgent. The overhead valve configuration allowed higher revs and stronger airflow. The hemispherical combustion chambers improved efficiency. These were not aesthetic choices. They were engineering decisions that placed Crocker ahead of its time. It was a post-war motorcycle built before the war. Crocker did not freeze his design once it worked. He refined it continuously. Early models used exposed valve trains. Later iterations enclosed them for durability and cleaner operation. Casting improvements strengthened the heads. Combustion chamber designs were adjusted to improve airflow and reduce heat buildup. Customers could request customized displacement and tuning levels. Crocker would build to specification. This bespoke nature created a paradox. The very features that made the motorcycle superior made it difficult to scale. Each bike required labor-intensive machining. Production numbers remained small. Fewer than 72 big twins were built in total. In a different economic environment, that rarity might have been strategic. In the 1930s, during the lingering effects of the Great Depression, it was risky. Crocker's motorcycles were expensive. They could not compete with Harley's pricing because they were not designed for assembly line efficiency. Harley's factories were built for volume. Crocker's shop was built for precision. That difference mattered when customers were counting dollars carefully. Rumors circulated that Harley did not appreciate Crocker's public challenge. Some accounts suggest supplier pressure and quiet efforts to limit access to parts. Whether those rumors were fully accurate or partially exaggerated, they reflect a larger truth. Crocker had become a visible threat in performance circles. He was not competing on dealership reach, he was competing on speed, and speed influences reputation. Harley could tolerate a small competitor, it could not ignore a faster one. Even so, Crocker faced structural disadvantages. He did not have nationwide distribution, he did not have the capital reserves of Milwaukee, he did not have diversified product lines to buffer slow sales. Every Crocker represented a significant investment of time and material. If sales slowed, cash flow tightened immediately. The broader economy offered little comfort. The Great Depression had reshaped consumer behavior. Luxury performance motorcycles were not necessities, they were indulgences. Crocker's target audience existed, but it was limited. Wealthy enthusiasts and serious racers appreciated what he built. The average American rider could not justify the cost. By the late 1930s, another force loomed. International tensions were escalating. Material shortages were beginning to affect manufacturing industries. Steel, aluminum, and other essential components would soon be redirected toward military production. Small manufacturers without government contracts would feel the pressure first. Crocker's expansion plans never materialized. He had considered growth, but the financial math was difficult. Scaling production required investment in equipment, labor, and distribution. The return on that investment was uncertain in an unstable economy. Meanwhile, Harley-Davidson had already secured its industrial position. When wartime production began in earnest, larger companies were better positioned to pivot toward military contracts. In 1941, Crocker ceased production. It was not a dramatic collapse. It was a quiet end shaped by economics and timing. The motorcycles had not failed. The performance record was intact. Owners still possessed machines faster than anything else on American roads. But performance alone could not protect a small company from global forces. The motorcycle had beaten Harley on the street. It could not beat history. What makes this moment striking is not that Crocker disappeared. It is that it disappeared while technically ahead. There was no gradual decline in engineering quality. There was no loss of innovation. The design was still advanced. The reputation among enthusiasts was still strong. The problem was scale. Crocker had built America's first superbike. It was faster, rarer, and more advanced than its domestic competition, but it was also fragile in business terms. Without mass production, without broad distribution, without deep capital reserves, survival depended on favorable conditions. The late 1930s offered anything but favorable conditions. When the war began reshaping American industry, many small manufacturers vanished permanently. Crocker was one of them. Unlike Harley-Davidson, it did not return after the war with expanded facilities and renewed capital. The shop in Los Angeles had created a machine decades ahead of its time. That machine would become legendary. The company behind it would become history. Yet the disappearance did not erase the impact. In fact, it intensified it. Scarcity transformed Crocker from competitor to myth. The same rarity that once limited revenue would later define value. But in 1941, none of that was guaranteed. What remained was a simple truth. Albert Crocker had proven that a small American workshop could out-engineer a corporate giant. He had built a V-twin that embarrassed Harley-Davidson in its own era, and when the doors closed, the performance record remained untouched. When production ended in 1941, Crocker did not close with a bankruptcy headline or a public failure. It simply stopped. Fewer than 72 big twin V-twins had been completed. Around 30 Speedway singles existed. That was the entire output of a company that had built the fastest American motorcycle of its era. The scale was microscopic compared to Harley-Davidson, but scale had never been Crocker's goal. Precision had been. Each Crocker had been built by hand. The engine cases were machined in-house. The transmission was designed and assembled under the same roof. The frame was built around the engine as a stressed member, eliminating unnecessary weight and improving rigidity. Customers could specify displacement and performance tuning. These were not production motorcycles in the modern sense. They were individual statements. This rarity created a problem in the 1930s and a legend in the decades that followed. In the Depression-era economy, bespoke engineering translated to high cost. Buyers were few. Dealers were limited. Crocker never built the distribution network required to compete nationally. He was competing with giants that operated factories with deep supply chains and dealership footprints across the country. Crocker operated out of Los Angeles with a small team and limited capital. He had built a Superbike in an economy that rewarded mass production. The economics were unforgiving. Every engine required labor-intensive casting and machining. Every frame required careful assembly. Margins were thin unless prices rose, and rising prices narrowed the customer base further. Harley-Davidson could amortize tooling costs across thousands of units. Crocker divided them across dozens. Then came the war. As global conflict escalated, raw materials became strategic resources. Steel, aluminum, and skilled labor were redirected toward military production. Larger manufacturers pivoted quickly. Harley-Davidson secured military contracts and reoriented its production capacity. Smaller operations faced a harsher reality. Without military contracts or capital reserves, survival became unlikely. In 1941, Crocker ceased motorcycle production. There was no dramatic collapse, no scandal, no engineering failure. It was timing. It was capital. It was the structural disadvantage of a workshop competing in a consolidating industry. The machine had outrun Harley. It could not outrun global history. After the war, American industry consolidated further. Harley-Davidson emerged stronger, buoyed by wartime production and national recognition. The post-war boom favored companies that could produce at scale. The era of small, performance-focused manufacturers narrowed dramatically. Crocker never restarted. The tooling was sold. The brand faded into quiet obscurity, yet something unusual happened in the decades that followed. The scarcity that once limited revenue began to define value. Collectors started to rediscover the Crocker V-twin. They compared specifications. They studied horsepower figures. They looked at the money-back drag race guarantee. They examined the in-house engineering and the stressed member frame. The realization became unavoidable. Crocker had built America's first superbike before the term existed. By the late 20th century, Crockers began appearing at auctions. Prices climbed steadily. Machines that had once struggled to find buyers during the Depression now commanded sums approaching $1 million in pristine condition. Museums sought them. Enthusiasts wrote about them. The myth grew. Part of that myth was rivalry. The idea that a small Los Angeles shop had embarrassed Harley-Davidson in the 1930s became irresistible. Even if Harley outsold Crocker by enormous margins, the performance comparison was undeniable. The Crocker produced roughly 50% more horsepower than its American competitors at the time. It exceeded 110 miles per hour when few domestic bikes could approach that speed. It offered customization decades before mass manufacturers embraced bespoke tuning. The Rebel had not been crushed by engineering failure. He had been crushed by scale. The legacy extended beyond raw numbers. Crocker influenced American motorcycle culture in subtler ways. Drag racing's roots in the United States trace partly to the performance rivalry Crocker encouraged. The visual language of compact, muscular American V-twins with exposed engines as the centerpiece would echo through Harley styling for decades. Even if unacknowledged, the impact lingered. And then, in 1997, something unexpected happened. Enthusiasts and engineers revived the Crocker name. This was not a superficial brand resurrection. It was an attempt at preservation. Using original blueprints, casting molds, and historically accurate metallurgy, the new Crocker team in Los Angeles began producing continuation models. These were not reinterpretations. They were faithful recreations of the original machines. Each engine case was machined in-house. Each gearbox assembled meticulously. Each frame built with attention to historical accuracy. Prices exceeded $100,000. Buyers understood that they were not purchasing convenience. They were purchasing craftsmanship and legacy. The company that could not survive the 1930s returned as a guardian of its own myth, but the revival underscores a larger question. Could a company like the original Crocker survive in today's motorcycle industry? Modern manufacturers operate within global supply chains, regulatory frameworks, and capital requirements that dwarf the 1930s environment. It is often said that launching a new motorcycle brand today requires at least $100 million in capital. Crocker operated with ingenuity rather than institutional funding. The original Crocker story remains compelling because it reveals a tension that still exists. Innovation often begins in small workshops. Breakthrough engineering frequently comes from individuals rather than committees. But scaling that innovation into a sustainable enterprise requires resources and timing that are not always available. Crocker's brilliance was not compromised by poor design. It was constrained by context. The Great Depression limited buyers. Production costs limited growth. World War II redirected industry. These forces did not evaluate horsepower. They evaluated survival. In the 1930s, 1930s, a rider who purchased a Crocker was not simply buying transportation, they were buying defiance. They were buying the fastest American V-twin available. They were buying a machine that challenged the dominance of Milwaukee and Springfield. They were buying a statement that performance mattered more than reputation. And when the shop closed, that statement became permanent. Today, when a Crocker is displayed in a museum or emerges at auction, it represents more than rarity. It represents a moment when American motorcycle engineering briefly leaped ahead of its largest manufacturer. It represents a time when one engineer's obsession with overhead valves, hemispherical combustion chambers, and weight reduction produced a machine decades ahead of its peers. The disappearance adds weight to the legend. Had Crocker scaled successfully, perhaps it would have become another established brand. Perhaps it would have diluted its performance focus in pursuit of mass appeal. Instead, it froze in time. It remains defined by its peak, not by compromise. That is why the story resonates. Crocker was faster than Harley in the 1930s. It built America's first superbike before the industry had language to describe such a machine. It offered proof instead of advertising. It engineered rather than assembled, and then it vanished. Not because the motorcycle failed, not because riders rejected it, but because economics and war reshaped the playing field in ways performance alone could not overcome. The rebel American manufacturer had achieved what few dared attempt. He built a hand-built V-twin so powerful it embarrassed the dominant brand of his era. He proved that a small workshop could challenge industrial authority. He demonstrated that advanced engineering could emerge from outside the corporate structure, and when history moved on, the motorcycles remained. They remained faster than the machines that outlived them. They remained rarer than the brands that dominated the market. They remained advanced enough to feel startling even by modern comparison. Albert Crocker did not build a global empire. He built something more concentrated, a brief incandescent chapter in American motorcycling, a superbike born too early for its own survival. That is why Crocker matters. Not as a footnote, not as a curiosity, but as proof that speed, innovation, and rebellion once aligned in a small Los Angeles shop and produced a machine that forced the giants to look over their shoulders. And even today, when one of those V-twins roars to life, it does not sound like a relic. It sounds like unfinished business.